Hello.
Hey, how you doing?
I am doing A-okay. How are you today?
Pretty good, pretty excited.
That's good. That's very, very good. I'm very excited for your talk.
How's the conference been going for you guys so far?
Very well. I'm feeling super duper inspired.
Good. Awesome. I was really excited because I attended in person last year and I was at first I was like, oh man, I'm so sad that I don't know what they're gonna do this year, but the whole statewide thing is really cool. Like so many people can come.
It is super duper exciting. This is my first summit. I'm
Mhm.
one of the newer interns at CWIT, and this has been an already amazing experience, and I'm very excited.
That's great. That's great. Um, I remember I told so I graduated from the University of Evansville, just south of here, and I definitely told a couple of my professors from there. I'm like, hey, if you want to tell the alumni and stuff, I'm speaking up here, and they're all like, oh my god, this summit is awesome. I want to come. So we had some Evansville alumni who were excited to join too, or to see what was going on. Um, so yeah. So I have just to let you know, I have if nobody has any questions at the end, I've got a number of stories that I could tell to fill the extra time. The last time I gave this talk, I had a full hour to speak, so I cut like 15 minutes off of it, and I definitely have content if we don't have any questions. So
Okay. I'll let you know when the 10-minute mark is for the
mhm.
end of the session, and we can go from there.
Awesome. I timed myself when I was caffeinated, and I timed myself when I was not caffeinated, and I come in somewhere between 40 and 48 minutes.
Okay.
I am not caffeinated this morning. This is decaf tea we've got here, so we'll see what happens.
Okay. Do you have a PowerPoint or anything?
I do. Um, I'm gonna share the entirety of screen two, I think, because when I tried to, oh wait, I didn't click the sound. I gotta share with the
All
sound.
right. I was gonna ask, do you have sound? Because when you click share screen, you want to make sure you click that button at the bottom.
You know, I always forget that sound button because it's the same on Teams. You have
Mhm.
to. Okay, so go up there. And then I'm one of those people that has to actually write out what I say, or else I blank like entirely. So I've got my script here on the other screen.
And sometimes I'm sorry, I have to write a script. Other times I'm like, whatever comes out of my mouth, hopefully hopefully I know what I'm talking about enough to get my point across.
Yeah. Yeah, no, words come difficult for me sometimes when I'm ad-libbing. I tend to be one of those people that just kind of like I'll freeze sometimes, and everything, no matter how well I know my subject, it just like blank. I'm like, oh man, don't want to do that. So we've got 17 pages of script. Everything is scripted.
You're very well prepared.
Thank you.
I did
Uh,
musical theater, and sometimes people would like forget their lines, or somebody wouldn't come on stage like at the right time. And so I've
mhm.
been in like multiple situations where I've had to like come up with stuff on the spot.
That is far more talent than I have. Gonna say that right now. I like writing. I can write, but ad-libbing in a professional environment, it just for some reason I blank out.
And it, it, I think it'll be great.
I hope so. It's all written out right here, so and I like it.
Have you given
And
this presentation
it does help that this isn't the first time I've given a variation of this talk.
before? Okay.
Um, this is kind of my yeah. We had a so I'm with Cornerstone Information Systems in town, and we had an employee lecture series.
Mhm.
It was like our first annual thing, and we all not all there were four there were three lectures and a panel this year. And it's just kind of an idea to like, let's get to know our colleagues a little bit, and we can keep it tangentially related to work, but we also wanted to see, hey, what are our colleagues into? So this was my talk. We also had someone do one called Collaging with Colleagues, and she talked about scrapbooking as a form of documentation. So that was fun. We had our data scientist has a professor or a doctorate in, oh my goodness, data analytics, but he specifically wrote his PhD on like looking at what causes war,
Mhm.
and particularly he focused around the 30 Years War in the 1630s, and like it was really cool. It was you're taking the data of like everything from harvests and weather patterns and stuff that happened beforehand, and then whether or not it led to violence in the society. So he did a talk on that, and then we finished it out with a panel on blockchain. So we had a couple of people who were, blockchain aficionados, whether it's Bitcoin or not, um, talking about how to apply blockchain in the tech industry and travel industry.
Yeah.
So
That sounds so cool.
it was a lot of fun. My husband was on the blockchain one, and I learned a lot. I learned a lot. We don't. I mean, obviously, we don't have Bitcoin. I could pay off my student debt with like two, but we do have Dogecoin,
Okay.
so we were able to bring that in a little bit. It's like Dogecoin. Yeah, but no, space is where it's at.
I love space. I'm an elementary education major, but my
Yeah,
concentration is science.
awesome. Second grade is where my fascination started. So you have you have the prime opportunity to so or fertilize some fields there.
Yeah.
Um, I'm starting my seeds, and I was just talking with my friend about her tomatoes, so that's where that came from. But no, space is like I lived in Florida when I grew up in Florida. Well, grew up in Michigan, lived in Florida for some time, and we could see night launches from the roof of our house when the shuttles went up.
How
Um,
cool is
so it was
that?
like literally the background to our lives down there. And then sometimes um so normally when a shuttle lands at Cape Canaveral, they would route it from the north. So they would like come over North Florida, do a turn towards south and land coming in from the north. But about a quarter of the time, and actually I have this as a story in the presentation, about a quarter of the time, especially during the summer, there would be a lot of thunderstorms over the Everglades, and they didn't want to route the shuttles through the thunderstorms. So they would route the shuttles coming in from the south. And when they came in from the south, we could hear the sonic boom over our house because we were like two counties down from the Cape. And I remember the first time after we moved there, when we heard that, we were like, "Oh my god, what was that?" And my mom was like, "There must have been like a truck that blew its tire or something." And I'm like, "We live in a residential area. I've never seen a truck come through here. What?" And then we turned on the news, and they're like, "Residents of Broward County probably just heard the sonic boom from shuttle whatever that was landing." And we're like, "Oh my god, that's so cool."
I am so jealous. That's so cool.
I've told all of my work, yeah, every single place that I've worked in the last like 5 years. The second we send up a manned shuttle rocket with an Orion capsule, so like the SLS. The second they send up a manned SLS, I'm gonna be there. I'm gonna like I have a friend that lives just outside of Orlando. I'm like, Stephanie, I am crashing on your couch. I'm gonna go to launch because those things are going to be almost as big as the Saturn V's were. And the story goes, you could hear the ground would shake for miles. You could see it for like ever. I'm like, I'm gonna go. And it's gonna be amazing. That's my goal in life right now is to just, and they're gonna start launching unmanned SLSs hopefully this November. So we'll see. They had a controlled burn of the engines about a month ago that did not go as long as they wanted. So like NASA watchers are sitting here going, are they going to be on time? Because the SLS program has not been on time for years. But they're saying they might still try to launch one in November. So and then the first manned one will probably be in 2024. And I'm like,
Yeah.
I want to go. Let's get people up there. Go to the moon. Go to Mars.
2 minutes till 11.
I can ramble on forever. I'm sorry.
Are you ready to start letting people in?
I am. Let's do it.
Hi,
Good morning. Good morning, everyone. Looks like we got 2 minutes, so we're still gonna let people join us, but grab a drink and a snack, and we will get ready to go. People who have seen me talk before usually are expecting my cat to pop up into the presentation. So
I hope so.
I'm there's a small chance we might have a cat in my frame at some point.
I love cats that join meetings.
Yeah, fair warning. He usually knows when I'm talking. Like I'll start a video call or a Zoom call or something, and if he's not asleep, which I think he must be now, he can hear it from almost anywhere in the apartment. He's like chirp, chirp, meow, 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 and then he'll come up and he'll be like, "I want in on the conversation too."
They know.
Like you have very important things to add to the conversation, very important kitty things.
They make us all happy.
I saw this meme the other day and it was a cat with a devil and an angel on its shoulder, and it was like, interrupt the Zoom meeting, they'll be super embarrassed. And then interrupt the Zoom meeting, everyone will love you.
I saw that just this morning and I thought it was perfect.
It's true.
Yeah.
I mean, I can only imagine what's going through my cat's head, but he has very important kitty things to add to the meeting. So he may or may not make an appearance. So it's 11 o'clock, and instead of actually, let me move this. Get this. There we go. So while we wait for everyone to come in, instead of just trying to fill dead air with small talk, I'm gonna tell a story, and it's not necessarily to understand the rest of the presentation, but I like telling stories. So when I was in middle school, so this would be like 99 and 2000, I lived in Broward County, Florida, on the Atlantic side of Florida, just north of Miami. And we were 4 hours from Cape Canaveral, and NASA is, as you can imagine, a pretty big deal down there. And when the shuttles landed, about a quarter of the time, due to weather or whatever over the Everglades, there's a bunch of thunderstorms in Florida all the time, the shuttle would be vectored into the Cape to approach from the south instead of the north like they usually did. And when this happened, we could hear the sonic boom of their reentry over our house through the whole county. And after a few hurricanes knocked down some trees in our neighborhood, we also had a clear sight to the northern horizon from our rooftop, where we could see the fireball of night launches from our roof. And one year, my Girl Scout troop took a field trip to the Cape. Now, most of us had been there before. We only lived like 4 hours south, so it was a common field trip in school. But this time, we were going to be staying overnight in the museum with a bunch of other Girl Scout troops. And we actually slept under the Saturn V rocket in the museum. And let me tell you, curled in my sleeping bag, looking up at this behemoth, logic like flies out the window of your 13-year-old brain. And I was convinced that it was going to fall on us and crush us. Did not get a wink of sleep that night, but I did get to touch a moon rock on that trip, so #worth it. So if you ever wondered, why am I giving a talk about space? Well, I would say it started right here. I also have a short test. I have some videos in this, and this is the first time I'm using Zoom. So I trust that it works, but I do have a number, video clips in this presentation, and I want to make sure the sound is working for everybody. So I'm going to test it with this clip from NASA's Public Relations Department at the Johnson Space Center, and just let me know if you can hear the audio.
So after the astronauts get back from the space station, it usually takes them a while to get adjusted to life on Earth.
Launch on the Soyuz is amazing, quite a bit different from the shuttle. The Soyuz is a bit more like...
with the whole gravity thing?
Sorry. The Soyuz actually is a bit shaped like this pin and goes up straight up through the atmosphere. Now, you've got the space station right up there. It's doing gravity.
So
Sound good? We have some laughing emojis. All right, good.
That's good.
It is 11:04. Story time is done. Let's fly. So thank you, everybody, for coming to Lessons from Space, channeling the right stuff in your work and life. My name is Liren Falzoni, and I'm the marketing manager for Cornerstone Information Systems, which is a very proud sponsor of CWIT. We're actually located just down Kirkwood, a few blocks from campus, and this program is really near and dear to our hearts. So we're just really excited to be involved in the summit and very proud to see so many people here. We did have a networking session yesterday, and it was great. So a big thank you to IU and to CWIT for hosting all of this for everybody. So as for me, while I do work in the tech industry now, I actually graduated in 2009 from the University of Evansville with a BA in history and archaeology. And unfortunately for me, that was the dead middle of the recession. So I kind of had to reinvent myself. But that's also kind of one of my core messages in this presentation. So I wanted to give a few expectations and also a few pre-show credits here as well. Space race was iconic to world history. We remember it fondly as this heroic time, but it was actually incredibly tense. And for most of it, the Soviet Union was miles ahead of America. So how did America catch up, and how did we eventually end up winning? It turns out a lot of the processes that went into it are the same that we use today. There's even a section of this presentation I call "The US Gets Agile." And honestly, that's exactly what we did. I know there was a talk about the agile process and mentality earlier. It's agile TM, not agile, the adjective. So you'll be getting a crash course here, a little bit on what agile development means in just a few. So today we are going to explore motivation, necessity, and the effects of competition versus collaboration, and how teams can be better via specialization and cross-training. And of course, the moral that we should never, ever, ever get complacent in our work and efforts. As for the presentation itself, I do have a few clips lined up throughout. Some are going to be historical footage, and some are going to be clips from my absolute favorite movie ever, 1983's The Right Stuff, which is where you get the name of this presentation. The movie is based on the Tom Wolfe novel by the same name and is the story of the American Mercury program. I can't recommend it enough if you are interested in that era of history. One more rather serious note. Some of the scientists in this discussion are going to be ex-Nazis from World War II. The Cold War and the space race were very tense, very turbulent, and nothing was morally black and white. I'm not going to endeavor to discuss what the employment of Nazi scientists meant for either America or the Soviet Union, because this is only a 45-minute presentation. But I would be happy to provide recommendations on follow-up research and commentary on the subject if anyone is interested. One of my friends is actually a Holocaust researcher in North Carolina, and I did consult with her before giving this presentation, particularly because you'll see figures like Wernher von Braun, who was the head of the German V2 rocket production in World War II, became American heroes in the 50s and 60s. So fair trigger warning for anyone in my audience today. We have to kind of put on our historian hats and sift through everything to reach the truth of the era. So a very, very brief history, brief background. I'm not going to spend too much time on this slide or the next, but I wanted to get everybody up to speed. Some of you already know this. Some of you remember the space race as it was going on, maybe, if we've got any professors in here. I know my dad gets worked up just talking about what he felt knowing that people were walking on the moon. He said that he went out at night and looked up thinking, oh my God, there are people up there right now. But for those that need a quick background, here we go. This is Mighty Woman #1, Cecilia Payne, aka the mother of astrophysics, shown here alongside Harvard's computers back when that was a job title and not a type of machine. So Dr. Payne actually determined what stars are made of, solidified the science on how to measure that, and alongside computers such as Annie Jump Cannon and Henrietta Swan Leavitt, they classified over 250,000 stars in our night sky today, along what is now known rather as the Harvard Spectral Classification System. So that's one of the major ways that stars are classified nowadays, started with Cecilia Payne and Annie J. Cannon. The early 1900s saw a fascination with rocketry. So America, Germany, France, and Russia all produced scientists who would later be known as the four fathers of rocketry: Robert Goddard, Hermann Obrist, Konstantin Tsiolkovsky, and I am so sorry to anyone that speaks French. I cannot pronounce this. It's Robert Hénault Pitre, I think. Many of those that led the space race were monitored directly by these four scientists. During World War II, the Axis and the Allies were at a tech race trying to reach multiple breakthroughs. The rocket, the jet engine, the submarine, and the atomic bomb were all being developed or improved upon at a breakneck pace, and Germany held the lead on all but one of them, and you can guess which one America got to first. So after World War II, there was a massive scramble to acquire the German scientists that had worked on the other projects. Story goes that roughly 70% of the German missile division under scientist Wernher von Braun wanted to surrender to the Americans, and about 30% preferred to surrender to the Soviets. Operation Paperclip was American program to capture and bring over as many of them as possible, and Operation Oza Aviachim was the Soviet program to do the same. And in the end, a majority of von Braun's team did end up in American hands. One of his right-hand men, Helmut Guttrup, actually ended up being taken by Oza Aviachim October 22nd, 1946, along with about 2,200 other people. So all in all, the entire space race would rely from here on out on three main things: government funding, government approval, and the leadership of the two men pictured here. So the top right is Sergei Korolev. He is a Soviet scientist who actually had just spent 6 years in the Gulag. He was removed from the Gulag to head up the the USSR missile program. And then opposite him on the bottom right is Werner von Braun, who would be the de facto leader of the American missile program. So here we go. We're all set up. Operation Paperclip versus Ozav Yakim. Who won? Whose Germans were better? Well, we got von Braun, so he would probably say the American Germans were better. But this is actually a clip from a movie, The Right Stuff. Brings us to our first clip.
There you go. Thank you. This footage was assembled from sources operating under deep cover at great risk. Very great. And we're very fortunate that this material did not perish with a couple of men. This is secret footage of the Russian Korabl rocket. And these are the German scientists that they captured after the war.
Was it them? Was it their German scientists got them up there first?
No. No, it was not, Senator. Our Germans are better than their Germans.
I always have to play that because my family quotes that all the time, and it's kind of iconic to anyone who knows me. But were the American German scientists better than the ones the Russians got? Well, the U.S. did get the first in the space race when we broke the sound barrier in 1947. Chuck Yeager's X-1 jet engine was an American design, but it was one of our first, and it was never actually deployed in combat. But this was 1947, and the U.S. and the Russians, we were buddies, right?
I want to place a long-distance call to Los Angeles.
Who are you calling?
The press. This is big news. Sound barrier's finally been broken.
No, sir. No press.
What?
No word of this is to go beyond the flight line.
What's going on here? This is big news. We need coverage of this.
No, sir. Sorry. No press. Those are orders. National security.
But the war's over.
Well, look, pal. Maybe they don't want someone to know.
Who?
The Russians, maybe.
The Russians, they're our allies.
Well, anyway, someone figured it out that way. And that's the way it is.
And, we were allies at that point. So it wasn't, a competition at first that many people considered. The Cold War hadn't fully gotten underway yet, but it did really quickly. So within a very short amount of time, the USSR, they got Sputnik up. That was the first satellite. They got a living creature into space. That was Laika the dog. We did follow up with a satellite to get into orbit with experiments after that. So, America kept its step. But then USSR got the first probe to the moon with Luna 2. Then they got the first human into space, Yuri Gagarin, who was also the first person to orbit the Earth. So, that in and of itself, you'll see in a minute, is amazing that the first, launch that the USSR got into space also orbited the Earth. And then they also sent the first woman into space, Valentina Tereshkova, who, I wanted to take a moment to mention, she was not only the first woman in space, but she was the only woman to go up for the next 19 years. She was followed by Russian cosmonaut Svetlana Zavitskaya in 1982, and Svetlana was also the first woman to perform a spacewalk. Only in 1983 did Sally Ride become the third woman and the first American to ride into outer space. So took us long enough. So at this point, you're probably thinking, hey, this was supposed to be a motivational speech. Even John Glenn got tired of being, quote, forthright and magnanimous about how the Russians, again, quote, just kicked the pants off of us. And you're also thinking, well, I know how this ends. It ends with Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin, not with someone named Sergei or Yuri. And no, this point is just to show you exactly how far behind America was. You know what our rockets had done until the early 60s? Blow up. Unmanned, of course. But they blew up on the launch pad. They blew up after launch. one even is known for having like turned around in midair, pointing back to the Earth, and so before the self-destruct mechanism was triggered from the ground. American rockets were so much of a laughingstock that one newspaper famously called the failed launch of the Navy's Vanguard missile Flopnik and Kaputnik. And now, one thing does need to be made clear. In all fairness to one of the protagonists of our story here, von Braun's team did not produce a Vanguard missile that was deemed Kaputnik by the press. Already, Congress was insisting that military branches compete for rocket contracts, and von Braun was working with the Army. The Vanguard was a Navy rocket. However, after Kaputnik's failure, von Braun turned right around, successfully put up an American satellite with one of his Redstone rockets. And, maybe Congress was thinking about the financials. Maybe they were trying to be bipartisan between their military branches. But really, the prevailing theory is that they were also worried about the optics of having the US space program headed by ex-Nazis, which is probably a very fair assessment. But the Redstone worked, and like it or not, America was off the ground thanks almost entirely to the minds of its paperclip scientists. President Kennedy would waste no time.
But why, some say, the moon? Why choose this as our goal? And they may well ask, why climb the highest mountain? Why, 35 years ago, fly the Atlantic? Why does Rice play Texas? We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win, and the others too. We shall send to the moon 240,000 miles away from the control station in Houston, a giant rocket more than 300 feet tall, the length of this football field, made of new metal alloys, some of which have not yet been invented, capable of standing heat and stresses several times more than have ever been experienced, fitted together with a precision better than the finest watch, carrying all the equipment needed for propulsion, guidance, control, communications, food, and survival on an untried mission to an unknown celestial body, and then return it safely to Earth, re-entering the atmosphere at speeds of over 25,000 miles per hour, causing heat about half that on the temperature of the sun, almost as hot as it is here today, and do all this, and do all this, and do it right, and do it first before this decade is out, then we must be bold.
I get goosebumps every time I hear that. So yeah, in one of the most historic speeches given by any U.S. president, he urged us onward. Now, just 23 days after that, Soviet cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin became the first man in space. And Alan Shepard was very ready to be the first American. Later, Shepard was quoted as saying, "That little race between Gagarin and me was really, really close." After several delays and more than 4 hours in his capsule, Shepard was ready to go, and he famously urged mission controllers to fix this little problem and light this candle, referring to the Redstone rocket that he was sitting on top of. And this is such an iconic quote from the space race that Alan Shepard's biography is called Light This Candle, and it's been made part of every movie and every book about the era. So now we get to the part I promised. The U.S. gets agile. So agile, if you don't know, it's, whoops, sorry. If you're not familiar with agile, one of the goals is to have, quick iterations, smaller teams. Well, not necessarily. I'm sorry, I actually lost the place here in my slide deck. So there it is. Agile is supposed to be able to break down big goals into small bite-sized chunks and to be able to get them done quickly. So Shepard was the first American into space, but unlike his cosmonaut counterpart, he was not the first American to orbit the Earth. Both he and Gus Grissom, from Lawrence County, Indiana, by the way, just south of Bloomington, wrote on suborbital Redstone rockets that went in parabolic arches and whose flights lasted roughly 15 minutes each. That was just enough to say that they've been to space and had some time in zero G. But hey, we needed a win, and we needed to prove that we could do this. NASA also needed to prove to Congress that the program was still worth funding. So really, any victory that could be put on the board was worth it. Enter the ladies from Hidden Figures. That movie has a really poignant scene in which mathematician Katherine Johnson solves the error in calculations that the Redstone had been suffering in getting into orbit. She would go on to successfully be behind the calculations in getting the Atlas rocket, which astronaut John Glenn rode, into orbit as the first American to circle the Earth. I mentioned we talk about Agile. One of the goals of Agile is to have quick projects with small iterations, take baby steps one at a time, and that's exactly what we did. 2 flights went up before Glenn could orbit, and a lot more would go up testing tech and testing math before we ever got to the moon. Now, another ideal behind Agile is less siloed teams. The astronauts became engineers instead of just test pilots. Some focused on learning how life support systems worked. Here pictured at the bottom, Neil Armstrong is working on the lunar module crew to help design and test aspects of this system, which is why he was later chosen as the first lunar module pilot. And to the side, Gus Grissom joined the team designing the Apollo capsule. And this is why his team was chosen to be the first to fly in it. So the last Agile goal are shorter, more digestible goals. So after our first few trips in Project Mercury, the American program realized that they couldn't just focus on the moon. They had to break down the whole endeavor into smaller goals first. There were a lot of unknowns at this time. How do you rendezvous in space with another object as tiny as yourself compared to the Earth? How does spacewalking work? Not very well the first few times, on either American or USSR terms. And how well does the human body do after a prolonged period in space? The trip to the moon and back would take a week. So there was a lot of stuff to learn, a lot of stuff to figure out, and maybe it's more grandiose than we think of problems that we have to solve here on our own work, but the general formulas, still apply. Granted, not all setbacks were minor. The darkest spot of the space race on either side was the loss of the Apollo 1 crew on January 27th, 1967. And the morale here is about listening to your teammates. Forging ahead in a gung-ho manner towards a lofty goal is fun and glamorous, but listening to you when your teammates bring up a problem is imperative. I'd mentioned before that Gus Grissom had specialized in the engineering and design of the Apollo command module. He's the one in the center in this picture. Well, he knew there were flaws, so many, in fact, that his crew famously hung a lemon on their capsule to show their discouragement and took this photo as their alternate crew photo for Apollo 1. Ed White, Gus Grissom, and Roger Chaffee were killed when a fire broke out in a dress rehearsal of launch. The fire was caused by a spark in some faulty wiring. It was fed by the 100% pure oxygen environment, and the astronauts were trapped due to the cumbersome hatch design, which had already been agreed to be redesigned in the next iteration of the capsule. So now that there had been a tragedy, the space program would listen. The whole program was actually put on hold for 2 years while the entire command module was redesigned. The only thing that had worked so far was von Braun's actual missile. His team conducted a number of unmanned tests, which became known as Apollos 2 through 7, each one flying higher and faster than before. He also became even more and more the face of the rocket program at this point, appearing on American television shows, giving cursory lessons on how the whole thing worked. He was tasked with the near impossible: improve NASA's tarnished image after the disaster, and keep faith that the American people that even though there were only 3 years left in the decade, they were still going to meet Kennedy's goal of landing a man on the moon by the time the decade was out, but the clock was ticking. And I've got a very short clip of one of his interviews talking about what he felt was the real significance of the whole space program and why lofty goals are important to actually getting science done.
There's undoubtedly a prestige element involved in being the first on the moon, but I think the real significant thing about the Apollo program, our lunar landing program, is that it serves as a focusing point for a vast scientific and technological effort that could never have been mounted and conducted with this kind of determination had it not been for a firm target in space and time. In other words, you cannot have a hard-hitting program when you don't have a clear objective, like let's land a man on the moon in this decade. If you say just let's go out into space and see whether we find it interesting, you spend most of your time arguing with other people what the more important things are, and you don't get a job done. You also don't get congressional support for this kind of a thing. And so it is really the byproducts of the Apollo program that are more important than a timely landing on the moon itself.
So what he spoke about there is still super relevant today. NASA wants to go back to the moon and then to Mars, but we're still getting pushback in the form of arguments like, we should solve our problems here on Earth first and then worry about space. But had we done that back in the 60s, we would not have benefited from all of the tangential advancements of the Apollo program. MRIs, CAT scans, scratch-resistant lenses, solar panels for energy. What was improved significantly, not just invented for spaceflight? Polymers that now go into firefighting equipment, artificial limbs, robotics, LASIK eye surgery, massive improvements in water and air filtration systems, shock absorbers, ice-resistant tech for airplanes, and wireless technology in general. Take a moment and think of every single thing that we get every single day from satellites. This is reliant on tech that came out of the Apollo program: GPS, phones, internet. But if you don't have that focused goal with the hard-hitting, we will land a man on the moon parameters, then it's much harder to both motivate a team and get things done. Now, obviously, we did land on the moon before the decade was out. First, the Apollo 8 orbited the moon without landing, and astronaut Bill Anders took the famous Earthrise photo. Astronauts Frank Borman and Jim Lovell of the Apollo 13 fame rounded out the first crew to ever leave low Earth orbit and enter the orbit of another celestial body. Apollos 9 and 10 followed in their footsteps, testing out various different equipment in lunar orbit, getting ready for the grand finale of Apollo 11. Famously landed the lunar module named Eagle with Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin on board, while crewmate Michael Collins orbited the moon in the command module Columbia. From the Sea of Tranquility on the moon, July 20th, 1969, before the decade was out, America broadcasted what was ostensibly the end of the space race to what is still one of the most watched TV broadcasts in human history. We followed that up with Apollos 12 through 17, highlights of which included bringing a lunar rover, starting on Apollo 15 so that the astronauts could reach points of interest further from their landing site. And also, Alan Shepard smuggled up 2 golf balls using a piece of equipment as a golf club just before they left, so he could see what it was like to play golf on the moon. Story goes that his suit was so bulky, he actually had to swing one-handed, and he missed the first one, sending it only like a foot or so. But the second ball he hit straight on, And through to his dying day, he swore he never saw where it landed and wondered if it was in lunar orbit. NASA scientists say that this is impossible, but it's still fun to think about. Like, how incredibly human is that? We'll get to the human factor in a second, but I just want you to imagine, you know, the pinnacle of human technology at that point was used to play golf on the moon. So what about the Soviet moon rocket? You know, where was the Soviet Union at this point? Because they did have a moon rocket, and they did have plans to send humans to the moon as well. Remember, they'd gotten their, you know, the first probe to the moon with their Luna 2. What happened? You know, first of all, this is the N1L3, or just the N1, and this was the Soviet response to the Saturn V. Construction of this design actually began after construction of the Saturn V's and was just as rushed as the original Apollo 1 design, but far more underfunded. As much as it pains me to say it, they also did not have the tragedy of the Apollo 1 fire to temper the rush that they put on the construction. So here's a comparison of the size of the Saturn V and the N1. If you squint, there's a tiny little human at the very bottom for scale, and there are a number of major structural differences between the two. The Soviet rocket tried to shed some weight by attaching the different stages with lattices instead of having a solid column. Korolev also had a major argument with the Soviet fuel industry. He wanted to use liquid hydrogen since it was an efficient propellant, but it was mandated that he used RP1, or rocket propellant 1, or refined petroleum 1, you can call it either way, which provides a lower efficiency than liquid hydrogen, but it's cheaper, denser, and most importantly, the Soviet manufacturer had more clout with the Kremlin. This was actually a major issue for Korolev, one that he never really recovered from a design perspective. For reference, the Saturn I also used RP1, but it used RP1 in its first stage, and it used liquid hydrogen in its other two. And today, depending on who's launching, whether it's a Soyuz or SpaceX, they use either both or one or the other. They're both still in use today too. But the biggest physical difference between the N1 and the Saturn V is that the N1 had 27 engines at the bottom that all had to light at once. And the Saturn V had, wait for it, 5. Korolev famously exclaimed upon one of the failures of a test launch that I have 27 engines that all need to light at once. Von Braun only has 5. What do you expect? But even though there's all of this, the biggest hit to the Soviet space program wasn't the moon rocket that continuously blew up on the launch pad. Instead, it was the death of its leader, Sergei Korolev, in 1966. The genius that had led the Soviet Union to earlier victories in almost every aspect of the space race actually succumbed to a kidney disorder, among other issues, that most historians agree was the result of his 6 long years of hard labor in the Siberian gulags decades earlier. And none of his successors were able to get the Soviet program back up off the launch pad. So the space race was over, and against all odds, America had won. The Cold War did drag on, of course, but American technological superiority was secured. The Cold War late phase, 79 to 85, was marked by massive tensions, but not as much technological posturing. The space race was done. The largest nuke had been detonated back in 1961, and even though nuclear war was still a possibility, no one was trying to build bigger nukes, just more of them. I don't really want to gloss over, or make any of this less important than it was, especially for those who experienced it, but it's not so much the point of this presentation. After 1989 and the fall of the Berlin Wall, America and the USSR began cooperating more and more in the realm of space. So reusable rockets or rocket parts were researched. The American Space Shuttle program began in 1981 and would run until 2011. The USSR and later Russian Soyuz rocket was adopted from earlier Korolev designs and reached its peak in the 1980s alongside the Space Shuttle, though it is also still in use today. The shuttle is not. Granted, the Soyuz still has a crazy number of engines, but it's not 27. There we go. It's not 27. They're clustered so that they fire almost as if it's really just 5, and compare that to the space shuttle, which had 3 main engines and 2 solid rocket boosters. So that's also 5 that had to go off at the same time. You know, they were a lot more comparable. These 2 vehicles were used to reach the American space station Skylab and the USSR station Mir. Skylab launched in 73 and Mir launched in 86. So nowadays, we might not bat much of an eye at spaceflight. It's routine. It's just something that humans do. You know, China joined the ranks of crewed launches in 2003, bringing the capability of Earth to send people into space up to 3 nations. Taikonauts have joined the ranks of astronauts and cosmonauts. India, Europe, Japan, Israel, Iran, and North Korea have all launched orbital missions, mainly satellites, and many other nations have planned to and are developing their technology for it. But we also tend to be, well, human. You know, once things get less routine and less scary, Alan Shepard golfing on the moon was the beginning, but the International Space Station has been a place of fun as well as science. You know, from the first zero-G badminton game to the first zero-G soccer to zero-G chess. And I couldn't find the photo of it, but one astronaut posted a picture to his Instagram of his laptop running the video game Alien Isolation while aboard the ISS, which might be double the thrill since that game is about being alone on a derelict spaceship while you're being stalked by an alien that for the most of the game you are unable to fight. To my favorite story, if we have time at the end, I'll tell you more, is Italian astronaut Samantha Cristoforetti. I'm sorry, I'm married to an Italian who's taught me how to say that. Samantha Cristoforetti, wearing her Star Trek uniform and drinking espresso in space. But routine breeds apathy. And here's the next lesson for everyone tuning in today. Don't get bored just because something has worked well over the past few years. In my only non-space quote today, Shuri in Black Panther tells her brother, just because something works does not mean it cannot be improved upon. But worse than that is, not improving is getting complacent. And this is an important lesson to take away as well, because complacency is launching your rocket in less than optimal conditions because the last 50 launches were fine. You know, complacency is seeing on the high resolution footage of a launch damage occurring to the insulating foam on a shuttle's wing and refusing to inspect further because of a mindset that there is nothing that can be done. So the text here on the right is an email that NASA leadership sent to Commander McCool of Columbia, who was on board the ISS at the time, and it spoke of the wing damage, but insisted that there was no threat to re-entry. In fact, foam breakage had been observed on previous shuttle missions, but nothing bad had ever happened before due to it. The phenomenon was later termed normalization of deviance by sociologist Diane Vaughan in her book on the Challenger launch decision process. I'm actually reminded of a quote of John Glenn. He said, you know, the entire time I was up there, I couldn't get the thought out of my head that every part of this rocket was supplied by the lowest bidder. And, you know, on a personal note, I was too young to remember the Challenger disaster, but I was definitely old enough to remember Columbia's breakup on reentry. I lived in Florida at the time, and you know what stuck with me was, yeah, I was devastated, but there wasn't the outpouring of grief that I expected, you know, that I felt. We had lost 7 astronauts, but I barely remember it making the news. It wasn't like Challenger, where the explosion was televised. It happened outside of TV broadcast, and it happened when the shuttle launches were so routine that they were background to daily news. This was 2003. This was during the 113th shuttle mission. In the past 112, only one had failed. And when this one failed, God, I remember being so angry that people just went on about their lives. It was a Saturday, and I know this because I was volunteering at the local Renaissance Festival at the time, and I was the one to bring the news to our encampment. And you know what happened? Nothing. The day went on just like every other normal day at the South Florida Renaissance Festival. And I think in some ways, that lack of reaction to such a catastrophe did a lot more to make an impression on me than even 9/11 had, because at least we reacted to 9/11, you know? We lived in Florida, for heaven's sake. On clear nights, I could see the fireball from the night launch from our roof, 4 hours south of the Cape. When the shuttles came in, routed from the south and passed over the Everglades on their way to the Cape, we could hear the sonic boom. Our lives were intimately entwined with the space program, and yet, I don't know, we just moved on. Florida still has a license plate honoring the Challenger disaster, but the only one to mention the Columbia is the license plate for the Astronaut Memorial Fund. So don't ever let yourselves get complacent. We here in the tech industry might not have as much human responsibility as NASA leadership, but our decisions still have agency. And just because something works does not mean it can't be improved upon. Just because something has always worked doesn't mean it can't break in the worst possible way. So they would want us to think ahead. And we're going to talk a little bit about legacies and new goals. And I'm actually going to tie this up very quickly by talking about my two favorite astronauts, Alan Bean and Buzz Aldrin. So Alan Bean is my favorite answer to the question, you walked on the moon. What are you going to do now with your life? All of the moonwalkers dealt with this in different ways. Some became very religious, some dove face first back into NASA, and some became educators. Some, like John Glenn, became politicians. And Alan Shepard returned to the golf course. Tried to go pro, don't think it worked out too well for him. But Alan Bean turned to painting. He'd always been an artist, and other astronauts remember him as sketching them in various places. But once he returned from his moonwalk, he needed an outlet for everything he'd seen and experienced. All of his paintings are highly textured, highly colorized, and every single one is is stamped by the boot that he used to walk on the moon. He was allowed to keep it. And in this way, he said that every painting of his is stamped with moon dust. Unfortunately, he passed away in May of 2018, but his name will live on in all of our history books. And then there's Buzz Aldrin, aka everyone's favorite grandpa. Buzz is always known to be a character, even back in the Apollo days. Story goes that after his flight to the moon, he sent the Air Force an expense report for the 500,000-mile round trip, and instead of paying it out, they sent him back a bill for the Saturn V rocket. He still has that framed and hanging in his wall in his house. So Buzz is really big on outreach, really big on education, and getting to Mars, obviously. He has a whole line of get your ass to Mars paraphernalia. And he's also known for punching conspiracy theorists. That last one isn't a joke. There's a well-known episode where he was approached by moon landing denier Bart Sibrel, who called Bart a liar and a coward. And I'll let you go find the video where Buzz socked him on national television for yourself, but Bart ended up being the one arrested in that situation for harassment. And just to point out, you can see an Alan Bean painting behind him in the photo on the left. Buzz is maybe one of the biggest proponents of science alive today. He took his experience and wanted to encourage the world to reach for the stars, and as his more direct lofty goal, to get to Mars within his lifetime. He might not have given a nationally televised speech at Rice University like Kennedy did, but his message is clear. We have a timetable. So we're coming up on time, and I wanted to be able to take questions if there were any, but let's just look at a quick recap of what we've talked about. Obviously, I could talk all day, and I've only related a few of the stories, but takeaways here. It isn't just enough to be motivated. You must know what drives you. What is your big goal? What's your intention? What do you want to accomplish and why? Like Wernher von Braun said, it isn't enough to simply go into space and see if it's interesting. We need to focus on a goal and work towards it. The other pieces will fall into place along the way. Need to reinvent a new math to achieve your goal? Go ahead. Remember in Kennedy's speech when he talked about using new alloys, some of which had not yet been invented. Don't let the lack of technology or of a facility hold you back. If you have a good idea, go for it. Code it, write it yourself, see what happens. You know, the worst thing that can happen is it doesn't work and you try again. Competition gets you far, but collaboration gets you further. Granted, competition can be very healthy, but once the goal is over, every team had its own way to reach their goal. You know, America might have gotten to the moon first, but the Russian Soyuz rocket of Korolov's design was much hardier than the space shuttle. For a decade, until SpaceX's recent triumphs, it was, you know, the Soyuz was the only ride to and from the ISS. We learned from each other's research. We learned, you know, we worked together, and now the ISS is infinitely better and bigger than either Skylab or Mir could ever have dreamt of being. Specialization and cross-training on teams are both valid and necessary approaches. Astronauts specialized and scattered to different teams and worked on different projects, but they all had the commonality of their astronaut training and background to be able to communicate. So normally, an engineer working on life support and a flight mechanic working on the lunar module wouldn't be able to communicate too easily. But if both of these teams had an astronaut on it, suddenly the silos could be broken down. And finally, never, ever, ever get complacent. Besides the risks of seeing projects fail, complacency also doesn't allow for invention. You know, don't equate it with being bored, however. Boredom is a very human emotion that leads directly to innovation. You know, I'm bored with the current tech. What can I do that's new? Is a much different statement than this has always worked, ergo it will always work. Our technology is constantly changing, and if anything, COVID taught us that certain aspects don't survive major shakeups. We need to be constantly thinking about how our systems work, or else we will stagnate and eventually perish. So also, since you have access to this presentation, I've included my own recommended readings and viewings on the subject, or you can just screenshot this one. I have a lot more recommendations that fit on this slide. So if you're interested in anything specific, please let me know. These are just a few of my favorites or the ones I've enjoyed most. Few quick notes, the YouTube channels. Scott Manley is a huge space geek who keeps up with all of the recent news and publishes videos analyzing things like SpaceX launches, commenting on NASA goings on, and has videos about how mechanics works. Or if you're more interested in where we go from here, The Science and Futurism with Isaac Arthur is also a great choice. He focuses more on possible accomplishments with current and future tech, how humanity might colonize the stars, and possible solutions to the Fermi paradox, which is the question of, if the universe is so huge, why haven't we found other life? And hopefully in a few years, I'll be able to add another book to my list here titled The Correct Stuff, A Casual History of the Space Race by Jim Hawley and Liren Hawley Falzoni. My dad retired last year and was going crazy for things to do, so he asked if I wanted to write and help edit a book on the subject, and I couldn't say no. So congratulations for sticking with me this far. We've reached the end, and if anyone has any questions, I will be happy to discuss. I also have some stories if nobody has any questions to fill the rest of the time, but that is up to you. Nope. Well, that's one of the stories that I was potentially going to share. I'm trying to move there we go, move the camera over so I can look more directly at you.
Hi, I just had one comment. You were talking about the difference in the two spaceships that blew up. And I guess because I was there at the time, and the one with the Challenger was because it had a teacher aboard and everybody in America was watching. Yeah. School kids were all watching it. It was, I think she was a third grade teacher, the first one to go up in space. Yeah. And I think it numbed everybody from that point forward. Just a comment on that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And you know, please don't get me wrong. I think it's, you know, good, the outpouring of empathy and compassion and remembrance that we all have for Challenger. You know, Challenger, I mentioned it to my parents and they have the exact same reaction. I was floored that if Challenger got that kind of response, you know, why didn't Columbia, I think, is more of my point, because both of them are tragedies and both of them absolutely deserve to be remembered. The crews were heroes, in my opinion. And And in both cases, it comes down to the smallest things. The problem with the Challenger was something that had been manufactured 2 years before, fitted to the rocket, and could have supposedly been prevented by launching at a different temperature, waiting for it to warm up. With the Columbia, there was actually NASA and the American government were in talks to have a spy satellite pass close to the ISS so that they could take high resolution photos of the damage to the Columbia rocket. And at the last minute, they decided, no, we're not going to do that, because they thought, well, there would probably be nothing we could do anyway. And the idea was that it was better for the crew to not know than for the crew to do anything to it. And after the Columbia, they did start repairing the shuttle in orbit, but they didn't do it on that one. So, but both are sad. Both are sad. Both could have been prevented, but we got complacent. And I absolutely don't want to talk down to the Challenger disaster. So, any other questions or comments?
I don't know if you can see them, but there are a few comments in the chat.
Oh, I don't have the chat open. Where is the chat? Oh, there's the chat. Okay, let me bring that over here. I have. Thank you for everybody. History does play a role in our present, and future is a massive topic that is largely overlooked. Commenter has 2 history degrees and found a home in the tech field also. Yeah, merging those two, it goes together a lot better than people think it might. So there are some stories I missed because I had to cut them for time, but the one I'm gonna share is the longest time in space. So let me go ahead. Recently, the US and Russia conducted a joint experiment to have 2 humans in space for a year to see what the effects are on the human body. The trip to Mars will be a few months, so, plus a few months back. So if we want to send people anywhere other than the moon, this is an important step. American Scott Kelly, whose twin brother, also astronaut Mark Kelly, was just elected senator from Arizona, and Russian cosmonaut Mikhail Kornienko spent 340 consecutive days in space together, going up and returning in a Soyuz, since that was still the only mode of transportation after the shuttles were retired in 2011. However, cosmonaut Sergei Kirkorov unexpectedly spent 311 days in space when the Soviet Union collapsed while he was on board the Mir space station. Imagine that you're only supposed to have a month flight, but at the end of that month, the country that sent you up no longer exists. Flights to Mir were drastically reduced, and Kirkorov ended up serving as engineer for multiple crews, since he was the only one of the cosmonauts trained for long-duration missions. He returned to Earth in March of 1992, where he was officially made a Russian citizen, and he is known as the last citizen of the USSR. Another fun story I have, just wanted to give a shout out to astronaut Mae Jemison. She is one of the only people that you can say are photoed or pictured on the bridge of 2 different starships, both doing her job in a legit setting. So she was an astronaut for the shuttle mission. She's pictured here in the that's the Japan created lab that was going up to the space station aboard Space Shuttle Endeavour. So she helped get that installed on the space station. And then LeVar Burton found out that she was a really big Star Trek fan. And he was like, hey, you gotta come on and come on for an episode. So she made an appearance on Star Trek, which was like a childhood dream of hers, as Lieutenant Palmer in Star Trek. So I found that pretty fun. And if we have time for one more, I want to go back to Samantha Cristofioretti. I promise I'm married to an Italian, and he, taught me how to say that. So Samantha here, talk about humans being human in space. She's seen here on the in the observatory of the ISS drinking espresso in her Star Trek uniform. How is she drinking espresso, you may ask? Well, astronauts need caffeine, and astronauts prefer that caffeine to be in the form of coffee. So for a long time, Americans had the American coffee machine pods, and Russians had the Russian coffee machine pods. And those coffee pods were essentially currency on board the ISS between the astronauts, that and peanut butter. Italy, however, wasn't on board with sending its first astronaut to the ISS just to drink what I imagine my husband, I quoted him on this, calling it watered down coffee flavored mud. So Italy spent its portion of the ESA budget that year to manufacture a zero-G espresso machine and sent Samantha up with both it and 15 espresso packets to start, which, as you can imagine, quickly became the premier trade good among astronauts from then on. So quite enjoyed that. Yes, snaps for Star Trek fans everywhere. I grew up in a Star Wars household, but I also appreciate Star Trek. I'm gonna, say that right here, get some visibility for both fandoms. No other questions. Well, I do have one other story and or tidbit, and I'm going to bring it up with this map. So, interesting tidbit about how rockets are launched. The closer a launch site is to the equator, the easier it is to get a rocket into space. So, and the other factor for a launch site is safety. If the rocket fails mid-launch, you don't want it crashing into a populated area. Finally, due to the Earth's rotation, it's easiest to launch with the rocket traveling from west to east. So this is all why America launches from Florida. It's furthest south we can get. And if the rocket fails, it falls into the Atlantic because it's going west to east. Russia's launch site, Baikonur in Kazakhstan, is as far south as the Soviet Union could get during the Soviet years, and to its east lies empty desert. So if the rocket fails, it falls into empty desert. Europe doesn't actually launch from Europe. If you look at the map, there's an orange speck in South America that is French Guiana. This is actually the home of the European Space Agency's launch site, again, near the equator, but with nothing but ocean to the east. The one nation that launches retrograde satellites is Israel. Launching east to west takes more fuel and is more difficult, but they would rather a failed rocket land in the Mediterranean than on one of the nations in the Middle East that they have rather strained relationships with, to say the least. Most recently, actually, after I made this slide, Virgin Galactic was able to launch a satellite from a retrofitted, I think it's a 747. So their idea is that they want Great Britain to start launching satellites from airplanes. Basically, the airplane can take off from any airport, fly to the equator in the middle of the Atlantic, and launch a rocket and come back. So the first stage of their rockets is an airplane now for Virgin Galactic, and I thought that was brilliant. So that's really going to open it up to launching from, these specific sites to launching from anywhere. Yeah. So with that, I think that's time. But if anyone has any questions, please don't hesitate to send me an email. It's in my profile, lfelzoni@ciswired.com. And I would be more than happy to either geek out or recommend some books or some, viewings, TED Talks, movies. I've seen a bunch of them. So Right Stuff, 1983, not the Disney miniseries. That's not as good. But you know, it works.
Thank you so much for this. This has been, for me, my favorite chat so far that we've had at the conference. And like I've talked a lot in the chat, but Star Trek fan can't help it. But
no, I'm glad to put a face to the comments.
Yeah, no, I'm really grateful that you talked to us about this. This has been incredible. So thank you very much.
Absolutely. Hey, like I said, shoot me an email if you want to geek out.
I would love to.
Yeah, I would too. Making COVID friends. Sweet. Any other questions or comments? Well, thank you. And thank you to IU and to CWIT for this opportunity. This is a lot of fun. And yeah, no, Cornerstone is always happy to work with CWIT and to work with IU. Have a good day, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, no problem. I have no idea how to stop this, so I'm gonna leave that to you.
I was like, I think we just end the meeting and then it'll do its thing.
I'm sure. I think I have to stop sharing for that. There we go.
You did an awesome job.
Thank you. And people can find my email address, right? That's like okay, cool. Yeah, no, I'm more than happy to geek out with literally anyone who wants to geek out about space stuff.
Yeah.
Cool.
Okay.
Well, thank you. Nice to meet you, Chantel. Thank you for all of this. It was a lot of fun.
Bye.
Bye.